Cora Shaw had come to believe the wind itself was her enemy, a living entity that had relentlessly pushed her westward for weeks. It had scoured the plains and whispered threats through desolate canyons. But here, in the high, jagged peaks of Montana's Bitterroot Range, it had become a physical monster. The storm it carried was a maelstrom of piercing rain and echoing thunder, turning the world into a blur of violent motion and profound darkness. Each step was a battle against the sucking mud of the trail and the sharp, insistent pain radiating from her ankle, a constant reminder of the life she was fleeing. She was less a person and more a prayer for survival, running on the final fumes of a will that had been nearly extinguished. Through the deluge, a light appeared, a single, hazy point of gold, improbable and fragile against the overwhelming dark. It was the first sign of warmth or shelter she had seen in 2 days, and it paralyzed her for a heart-stopping moment. The instinct for self-preservation, honed by months of looking over her shoulder, screamed at her to stay hidden within the anonymity of the forest. But the wet cold was a physical weight, and her body, a vessel of trembling exhaustion, could go no further. With a shuddering gasp that surrendered to fate, she pushed through the tree line. Her focus narrowed to that one distant light. It emanated from a solitary log cabin, built with the grim determination of a man intending to keep the world at bay. Its chimney breathing a steady plume of smoke into the chaotic sky. Within the cabin's walls, Josiah Thorne moved with the quiet economy of a man long accustomed to being alone. For 3 years, the house had been less a home and more a mausoleum for a life that had ended abruptly. Every object held the ghost of his wife. Lillian, her worn armchair by the hearth, the half-finished embroidery still in its hoop on a side table, the faint scent of dried lavender in the air. He navigated these memories daily, his grief a silent, suffocating blanket. The world beyond his mountain clearing had faded into an irrelevant hum. He had walled himself inside his sorrow, his daily rituals of chopping wood and tending the fire, the only rhythm left in a life otherwise defined by a vast, unyielding silence. He existed, but he did not live. The knock on his door was a sharp, violent intrusion, a sound so foreign it felt like a physical blow against the stillness. His body tensed, a lifetime of caution and solitude turning his posture rigid. No one came here. The trail was unmarked, his existence a deliberate secret. Another volley of knocks, harder this time, confirmed it was human. It was not the sound of a lost traveler, but of raw desperation. A cold annoyance settled over him. This was a violation of the unspoken pact he had made with the wilderness. He rose, the firelight catching the hard lines of his face, and unlatched the heavy door, intending to dismiss the intrusion with the cold finality he had perfected. The woman standing there seemed carved from the storm itself. She was drenched and shivering, her face a pale oval of exhaustion marked by a faint bruise along her jawline. Her clothes were shredded and plastered with mud, but it wasn't her desperate condition that stopped him. It was the look in her eyes. Beneath the sheer terror, there was a flicker of a defiant spirit, the ghost of a fight that hadn't been entirely extinguished. It was a look he hadn't seen since the final weeks of Lillian's illness, a stubborn refusal to surrender that resonated deep within his own dormant heart. Her voice was a hoarse whisper, barely audible over the wind. She offered a name that felt like a disguise and spun a thin story about seeking work in the mining town of Redemption. All she needed, she pleaded, was shelter from the storm. The barn, she added quickly, as if sensing his resistance. I won't be any trouble. Josiah's resolve wavered. Every instinct told him to shut the door and reclaim his peace. but the image of that defiant spark in her eyes held him fast. It was a flicker of life in his world of silent memorials. With a stiff, almost imperceptible nod, he stepped back, gesturing with his head toward the barn. The single word, "There." A concession that felt both profound and dangerous. He provided her with a dry horse blanket and an old lantern. The exchange, wordless and brief. From his doorway, he watched her limp coolly across the clearing, a small, resilient shadow against the storm, until the barn doors closed behind her. He secured his own door, the familiar sound of the bolt sliding home now offering little comfort. The house was quiet once more, but the silence had changed. It was no longer just his own. It was now shared, stretched thin between his cabin and the barn, charged with the presence of the unknown. The following days settled into a strange, silent routine. The woman, Cora, moved like a wary doe. She was up with the first gray light, performing the chores he hadn't asked her to do, sweeping the porch, mending a loose fence rail, clearing fallen limbs. She worked with a focused, desperate need to earn her keep, to remain invisible. Her silence was a shield, a promise not to intrude, and he honored it with his own. He watched her from a distance, a habit he couldn't break. He noted the efficiency in her hands and the constant tension in her shoulders. They were two solitary planets, orbiting in the same small clearing, but never speaking. The air between them thick with unspoken questions. The change came on the fourth day. Josiah was on the porch, mending a leather strap, the repetitive motion of the needle calming his thoughts. Cora was at the far end of the clearing, using a rake to gather fallen by needles. As she pivoted, her left foot snagged on an unseen root. She didn't just stumble. Her leg gave out from under her with a sickening finality. A stifled gasp of pain was the only sound she made as she caught her balance against a tree. She remained there for a long moment, her body rigid, her head bowed. When she finally moved again, she looked toward the cabin, her eyes wide and fearful. Seeing him, she quickly resumed her work, but the pretense was gone. Her limp was now stark and undisguised, each step a clear testament to an old and significant injury. Josiah's hands stilled. The detached observer in him vanished, replaced by the trained eye of the man who had once been a field medic. He saw it now with absolute clarity, the unnatural stiffness of her posture, the way she held her body to compensate for a deep structural weakness. It wasn't the limp of a weary traveler. It was the gait of someone living with chronic, concealed pain. His gaze remained fixed on her for the rest of the afternoon, his mind piecing together the small clues he had previously ignored. That night, an unfamiliar restlessness took hold of him. The quiet woman in his barn was more than a fugitive from a storm. She was a keeper of secrets written in pain. Long after the light in his cabin had gone out, he found himself walking toward the barn, a lantern in his hand, a feeling of grim necessity guiding his steps. He entered the cavernous space, the air thick with the scent of hay and cold earth. In the lantern's glow, he saw her asleep in a nest of hay, wrapped tightly in the blanket. He moved closer, his steps muffled by the dirt floor. His eyes scanned the area around her. And then he saw it, a dark, circular stain on the floorboards near her feet. It was small, but its meaning was vast. He knelt, the floorboards complaining under his weight, and extended a hesitant finger. The stain was dry but distinct. He lifted his hand to the light. The tips of his fingers were smeared with the dark, rusted color of old blood. A sudden, cold clarity washed over him. The mystery of the silent woman had just revealed its first violent chapter. And Josiah Thorne knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he could no longer remain a spectator. Cora Shaw felt the fragile peace of the morning shatter the moment she saw him walking toward her. The unspoken truce they had maintained for days was about to end. She gripped the rough wood of the corral fence, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains as if she could will herself to dissolve into them. Every instinct screamed at her to deny, to deflect, to wrap herself in the familiar armor of lies that had kept her alive this long. The man approaching was not her tormentor, but he was a key, and she feared the lock he might open more than anything. She could feel his presence behind her, a steady, quiet force that was somehow more unnerving than overt aggression. Josiah stopped a few paces away, his shadow falling over her. He didn't waste time with pleasantries. "The leg," he said, his voice calm but carrying a weight that permitted no argument. "You're favoring it more each day. An injury left untended in a place like this doesn't heal. It consumes." Cora's breath caught. She kept her back to him, her voice tight with forced indifference. "It's an old trouble. It comes and goes." He was silent for a moment, letting her denial hang in the crisp mountain air. "I spent 4 years patching men together on battlefields," he continued, his tone turning clinical. "I know the difference between old trouble and a wound that's poisoning you from the inside out. We deal with it now, or the wilderness will deal with you later." The finality in his words broke through her defenses. He wasn't accusing or judging. He was diagnosing. This quiet, persistent man was a different kind of threat, not to her body, but to the secrets she had paid for in blood. A wave of profound weariness washed over her, extinguishing the last embers of her resistance. She let out a slow, shaky breath and turned to face him, her eyes conveying a surrender that her lips could not form. He gave a single, decisive nod and gestured toward the cabin porch, a neutral ground where the truth might finally be brought into the light. She sat on the wooden bench, feeling small and exposed under the vast, indifferent sky. To her astonishment, Josiah knelt before her on the dusty planks, assuming a posture of service that sent a tremor of confusion through her. With trembling hands, she began to unlace her boot, each movement an act of immense effort. He waited patiently. Then his own large, steady hands took over, easing the worn leather from her foot with a care she hadn't felt in years. The rag she used as a bandage was a sorry sight, stained and grim. As he began to unwrap it, a cold dread coiled in her stomach. She braced herself for the gasp of disgust, the look of horror she had seen in her own reflection countless times. When the wound was finally exposed, the air grew thick and heavy. Josiah's clinical composure fractured, replaced by a deep, visceral shock. The flesh around her ankle was a swollen, inflamed mess, the clear sign of a festering infection. But it was the source of the wound that commanded his absolute attention. This was no simple injury. This was a desecration, carved into her skin, with a deliberateness that spoke of a patient, meticulous cruelty. Was the shape of a cross. It was twisted, distorted, its lines sharp and unnaturally deep, as if the artist had intended to scar not just the flesh, but the bone beneath. It was a symbol of faith warped into a mark of profane ownership, a permanent testament to a monstrous hypocrisy. Josiah stared, his mind reeling. The brutal, chaotic wounds of war were things he could understand. They were the product of fire and steel and madness. This, however, was intimate. This was the work of a man who had held her down and taken his time. He slowly lifted his gaze to her face, and what he saw there cemented the horror. Cora's eyes were distant, unfocused, her expression utterly blank. She had retreated to a place deep within herself where the memory could not touch her. She was a statue of endurance, her stillness a more powerful expression of agony than any scream. "Who did this to you?" The question tore from his throat, rough and raw. Her story emerged, not as a flood of emotion, but as a monotone recital. Her voice scrubbed clean of feeling as a form of survival. She spoke of a man named Jedediah Kane, her husband. She described his house as a church of one, with him as its sole, wrathful deity. She spoke of his obsession with purity, his belief in her inherent sinfulness, and his self-appointed duty to chasten her soul by breaking her body. The twisted cross was his seal, his claim, a permanent reminder that she was his to save or to destroy. As the barren words fell from her lips, Josiah moved with renewed purpose. He disappeared into the cabin and returned with a small, age-worn wooden box. Inside lay the tools of his former life: clean linen, a bottle of dark, sharp-smelling carbolic acid, and forceps. He poured water into a basin. The simple, practical actions, a stark contrast to the horrific narrative unfolding beside him. He was no longer just a grieving husband. He was the medic, the man who mends what has been broken. He offered no words of sympathy, for he knew they would be meaningless. Instead, he offered action. He began the slow, painful process of cleaning the wound. The antiseptic burned, and Cora flinched, her body going rigid, a sharp hiss of pain escaping her lips. He worked on, his touch methodical and unexpectedly gentle. He was not just tending to an infection. He was performing an exorcism, trying to cleanse the physical manifestation of her tormentor's hate. As he worked, he could feel the rigid tension in her body slowly begin to ease. When at last he finished, he wrapped her ankle in a thick dressing of clean, white linen. The stark bandage was a symbol of a new beginning, a single patch of purity over a landscape of pain. Cora looked down at her ankle, at the clean, white bandage covering the horrific mark. The quiet, focused care he had shown her was a language she had forgotten, a kindness so absolute it felt like a physical warmth spreading through her chest. It was the first crack in the wall of ice that had surrounded her for years. "Thank you," she breathed, the words small but resonant in the still air. Josiah met her gaze for a brief moment, then gave a curt nod, his own emotions too raw for speech. In that shared moment of vulnerability, a fragile truce with the world had been declared for them both. The following morning arrived with a deceptive tranquility. The air was clear, and a sense of cautious peace had replaced the tension of the days before. Josiah stood on the porch, a steaming mug of coffee in his hands, watching the sun crest over the distant peaks. Then his eyes fell upon the top step of the porch, and he froze, lying there, placed with ceremonial precision in the very center of the wood, was the body of a raven. Its feathers were undisturbed, glossy black, but its head was twisted at a gruesome angle. It hadn't fallen there. It had been put there. It was a sigil, a warning, a cold, calculated intrusion into his sanctuary. A primal instinct took over, and his gaze shot upwards, sweeping the forested ridges that formed a natural wall around his homestead. He searched for a break in the pattern, a shape that did not belong. At first, there was only the endless sea of pine and rock, but his eyes, trained by years of hunting, were sharp. He found him, high on a sunlit ledge to the west. A solitary horseman sat as still as the stone he was perched upon. The figure was too distant to discern any features, appearing only as a dark, foreboding silhouette against the bright sky. He was a patient predator, a sentinel of malice, observing the cabin with an unnerving stillness. After a minute that stretched into an eternity, the rider turned his mount with deliberate slowness and disappeared back into the depths of the forest. The message had been delivered. The ghost from Cora's past now had a face, a location, and a clear, menacing intent. Josiah Thorne stood alone on his porch, the warmth of the coffee gone, and knew that the isolation he had so carefully constructed had been irrevocably breached. Cora Shaw quickly learned that a visible threat is a different kind of poison than a pursuing one. The homestead no longer felt like a sanctuary. It had become the floor of a cage, watched from above by an unseen predator. Every creak of wood, every shadow that danced at the edge of the clearing, was a potential sign of his approach. The fear was a constant, low hum beneath her skin, but it was now tangled with a sharp, corrosive guilt. She was a plague, and she had brought a sickness to the door of the one man who had shown her a sliver of grace. This thought was a heavier burden than the exhaustion or the pain from her ankle. For Josiah, the sight of the rider had cauterized the last weeping wounds of his grief, replacing sorrow with a cold, focused rage. The wilderness he had chosen as his tomb had become a battlefield, and his instincts, honed by war and sharpened by loss, were now fully awake. He moved about the property with a hunter's awareness, his eyes not seeing memories of Lillian, but tactical positions, the defensive strength of the cabin, the vulnerability of the barn, the deadly sight lines from the western ridge. He was no longer a hermit hiding from the world. He was a sentry guarding its most vital outpost. Several days into this silent siege, he concluded that a single rifle was not enough. From a heavy, dust-covered chest, he retrieved a small, elegant revolver with a handle of worn pearl. It had been Lillian's, a beautiful, almost delicate object from a past life. Now, its cold weight felt practical, necessary. He found Cora near the spring, her posture radiating a tension that mirrored his own. He presented the pistol to her without ceremony. "The time for hiding is over," he stated, his voice even. "To survive what's coming, you need to know how to answer back." The weapon in her hands felt like a venomous snake, cold and filled with a deadly potential she found repulsive. It was the tool of men like Cain, an instrument of fear and finality. A part of her wanted to cast it aside, to reject its violent promise. But the memory of the twisted cross carved into her flesh was a powerful antidote to her hesitation. She understood. This was the brutal arithmetic of her new reality. Under his patient, almost detached instruction, she learned to hold it, to bear its weight, to find the balance between its deadly purpose and her own trembling hands. The process was slow, her revulsion warring with the grim necessity of the lessons. The true measure of Cain's reach was revealed on a moonless, storm-racked night. The wind clawed at the cabin, its howl a perfect symphony for an act of violation. Josiah was startled from a light sleep by a sound that did not belong to the storm, a soft, deliberate scrape from the main room below. In seconds, he was moving, his rifle a familiar extension of his body. The main room was still and dark. The doors and windows remained securely bolted. A trick of the wind, he almost allowed himself to believe. Then his eyes fell upon the table at the center of the room. and a coldness unrelated to the night air settled deep in his bones. There, placed with the precision of a jeweler, was Lillian's rosewood music box. For 3 years, it had lain dormant in a trunk in the attic, a sacred object too painful to touch. Now it sat before him, its surface wiped clean of dust, a polished ghost from his most private chamber of sorrow. He hadn't been robbed of an object. He had been robbed of his sanctuary. The intruder had moved through his home with contemptuous ease, bypassing locks and alarms to touch the one thing that was truly his. Cain had not come to steal. He had come to defile. He had sent a clear, chilling message. No wall can protect you. No memory is safe from my reach. I own this space now. In that moment, Josiah's fight for Cora's safety became an irrepressible war for his own soul. The following dawn, he rode for redemption. He left Cora with the pistol and a stern warning to stay inside. He needed to understand the web his enemy had spun. The town itself felt complicit, its dusty streets and weathered storefronts exuding an air of nervous conformity under the shadow of the gilded mountain mining company. At the sheriff's office, he found a weary man trapped in that web. Sheriff Brody listened intently, his expression grim. Cain is more than just a man. Thorn, Brody explained, his voice low. He's an instrument. The company uses him to tame the wilderness and the men who work in it. He has their blessing. And in this valley, that's a protection stronger than any law I represent. He spoke of a union organizer who had vanished from one of Cain's camps the previous year. Be smart, Brody warned, the unspoken words clear. You will find no official help here. The message was brutally reinforced at the general store. The proprietor, a man named Albright, greeted Josiah with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. But when Josiah requested several boxes of ammunition, the man's affability evaporated. He began polishing an already clean counter, refusing to meet Josiah's gaze. Can't do it, he muttered. Supplies are tight. Besides, stirring up trouble with the company's people. It's bad for business. It was a quiet, devastating dismissal. They were utterly alone, cast out not just by a villain, but by the silent consent of a fearful community. Josiah's ride home was a grim meditation on his own powerlessness. He had faced armed men in battle, but this enemy was an insidious fog, seeping into every corner of the world he knew. As he approached the turnoff to his homestead, the sharp report of a pistol shot echoed through the trees. A surge of adrenaline hit him, and he kicked his horse into a gallop, fearing he was too late. He burst into the clearing to a scene that stopped him cold. Cora stood in the open, her back to him. Lined up on a distant stump were several tin cans. The pistol was steady in her hands, no longer trembling. There was a brittle, dangerous calm about her, a stillness that had replaced the constant tremor of fear. As he watched, she raised the gun, took a long, focused breath, and squeezed the trigger. The shot rang out, and a can leaped from the stump. She did not react, simply began the slow process of reloading. She had felt his departure that morning, had likely known what he would find in town, and in the long hours of his absence, she had made a choice. She had stopped waiting for a savior. She had taken the instrument she hated, the fear she despised, and the sliver of instruction he had given her, and she had begun to forge them into a weapon of her own. Josiah sat on his horse, the rifle resting across his lap, and watched her. The dynamic had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer her protector. She was no longer his charge. They were partners, bound by a shared enemy and a silent, mutual understanding that from this point forward, they would fight as one. Cora Shaw had discovered that waiting for a battle is a unique form of torment, The days after Josiah's return from redemption were stretched thin, each hour fraught with a silent, hyper-aware tension. They moved in tandem, a grim partnership forged in isolation. Their need for vigilance a constant, unspoken dialogue. When the last of the rainwater was gone, they knew the journey to the stream was unavoidable. It was their lifeline, and also their most vulnerable point. A sun-dappled clearing surrounded by a dense, watchful forest. They went in the late afternoon, the time of long shadows, Josiah carrying his rifle with a practiced ease, and Cora feeling the unfamiliar weight of Lillian's pistol against her hip. A cold promise of the violence she prayed would not come. The streamside clearing was an oasis of deceptive peace. The air hummed with the lazy drone of insects and the soothing melody of water tumbling over smooth stones. Light filtered through the high canopy of pines, painted shifting patterns on the mossy ground. It was a place that should have felt safe. As Josiah knelt by the water's edge, the ambient sounds of the forest did not just quiet, they ceased entirely. The sudden, profound silence was a vacuum, a clear signal that they were no longer alone. Josiah was on his feet in an instant, his body a solid shield in front of Cora, his gaze sweeping the silent, ominous wall of trees. They materialized from the woods as if summoned from the earth itself. 4 figures stepping out from the shadows with a coordinated silence that spoke of long practice. 3 were brutish and thick-set, loggers whose faces were blank canvases of indifference. Their leader, however, was a study in contrasts. Jedediah Kane was tall and impeccably dressed in a dark coat that seemed to absorb the light around him. A small silver cross glinted at his collar, a pious adornment that was grotesquely at odds with the cold, proprietary light in his eyes. He moved with the fluid confidence of a man who believed the ground he walked on belonged to him. His gaze fell upon Cora, ignoring Josiah as if he were nothing more than a rock or a tree. "Cora," he began, his voice a rich, melodic baritone designed to soothe and command. "This rebellion has lasted long enough. You have strayed from your path and broken the covenant we made under God. It is time for you to return home." He held up a folded document, the official marriage certificate, presenting it like a writ of ownership. "The law of man and the law of heaven demand your obedience. You will come with me now." Josiah planted his feet, the rifle held across his chest. "She's not yours to command," he said, his voice a low rumble of stone against stone. For the first time, Cain's attention shifted to him, a slow, dismissive smile touching his lips. The broken soldier, seeking redemption by protecting a broken woman, he mocked, his eyes glinting with cruel insight. "You speak of command, but you could not command life to remain in your own wife. Do you truly believe you can defy me now, when I come to reclaim the soul that is mine?" The words were scalpels, expertly wielded to flay open Josiah's oldest griefs. Cain's attack was not just physical, it was aimed at the very foundations of Josiah's will. Josiah's face was granite, his fury a tightly coiled spring. Cain, mistaking control for weakness, nodded to the largest of his men, a man with a scarred face and empty eyes. "Ezra, fetch my wife." As the man lumbered forward, his hand outstretched, the spring inside Josiah snapped. The movement was a terrifying fusion of speed and violence. He didn't fire the rifle. He swung it, the heavy wooden stock connecting with the side of Ezra's skull with a sickening, definitive thud. The man collapsed like a felled tree. Before the second man could react, Josiah had dropped the rifle and drawn the long hunting knife from his belt. The ensuing fight was a blur of desperate, close-quarters combat. It was the terrible, fluid dance his body remembered from the war, a muscle memory of survival that was both ugly and brutally effective. He moved inside the man's clumsy swing, his blade a flash of steel, and the second henchman staggered back, clutching his arm, a cry of pain and disbelief tearing from his throat. The sudden explosion of violence stunned the remaining man into immobility. Cain himself had taken a step back, his hand reaching for the pistol at his side. Seeing the motion, Cora acted. A wave of pure, clarifying adrenaline washed away her fear. She drew Lillian's revolver, the pearl handle small in her trembling hand. She did not aim at a man. She aimed at the sky, at the suffocating silence, and pulled the trigger. The shot was a raw, deafening scream that ripped through the clearing. The smell of sulfur filled the air. The sound, so close and unexpected, sent Cain's horse rearing back in terror. He was forced to abandon his draw, his arms now full of panicked, struggling animal. The moment was broken. The balance of power, for a precious second, had shifted. It was into this tableau of chaos that Sheriff Brody and his deputy arrived, their horses charging into the clearing. Brody took in the scene with the weary eyes of a man who had seen too much of his town's dark underbelly. He saw the downed men, Josiah standing over them like a grim reaper, and Cora, pale but resolute, with a smoking pistol in her hand. He didn't draw his own gun. He sighed, a sound of deep frustration, and addressed the man at the center of the storm. Cain, I told you this was not the way. Cain, having wrestled his horse under control, dismounted, his face a mask of aggrieved authority. Sheriff, I am within my rights. This woman is my lawful wife. This man is an interferer and an assailant. He brandished the paper again. Brody glanced at it, then at the blood beginning to soak into the forest floor. The law doesn't give you the right to wage war on another man's property, he said, his voice flat. This is over, for today. Take your men and get off this land. If you want to pursue this, you will do it with a warrant from a circuit judge, not with hired muscle. Cain stared at the sheriff, then at Josiah, his composure returning. He knew he held the stronger hand in the long game. The law was a temporary inconvenience, a cold, knowing smile touched his lips. As you command, Sheriff, he said with mock piety. He and his remaining man hauled the groaning bodies of their comrades back into the woods before he disappeared. Cain turned one last time, his eyes locking on Cora. The look was not one of anger, but of absolute certainty. It was a promise that the next time he came, there would be no pretense of law, no third parties to intervene. There would only be a reckoning. They stood in the sudden, ringing silence, the sound of the stream now seeming unnaturally loud. The clearing, once a place of peace, was now a spoiled stage. Blood darkened the moss near the water's edge. The air was thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and hate. Josiah looked at the blood on his knife, then at Cora, who was staring at the revolver in her own hand as if she'd never seen it before. The immediate danger had passed, but the confrontation had changed everything. It had drawn a line in the dirt, and they both knew, with a chilling certainty, that Jedediah Cain would soon return to cross it. Cora Shaw knew, with the chilling certainty of a condemned soul, that the violence at the stream was not an ending, but a prologue. The days that followed were steeped in a tense, methodical vigilance. The homestead, once a silent refuge, now felt like a small, isolated garrison bracing for an inevitable assault. She watched Josiah move through his chores, his posture no longer that of a grieving hermit, but of a seasoned soldier inspecting his perimeter. He was preparing for a war of bullets and blades, a war she knew they were destined to lose. Cain would not come with just 3 men next time. He would come with an army, and he would not stop until he had reclaimed what he considered his. The thought solidified into a revolutionary idea one evening as she watched Josiah reinforce the window shutters. He was building a better cage, but a cage nonetheless. She waited until he was finished, until they sat in the tense quiet of the main room, the fire casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. "Your walls won't hold him back," she said softly, her voice cutting through the silence. "He will break them or burn them. We can't win by building our defenses higher." Josiah looked up from the knife he was sharpening, his eyes questioning. "What are you suggesting?" he asked. "That we run?" "No," she said, leaning forward, her eyes catching the firelight with a new intensity. "I've run my whole life. Running is what led me here. Cain's real power isn't in his fists or his men. It's in the silence. It's in the fear that keeps good men like Sheriff Brody from acting and men like Albright from selling you ammunition. He is a sickness that thrives in the dark. The only cure is to expose him to the light." She explained her plan, her voice gaining strength with each word. She would write it all down. Every threat, every verse of scripture he twisted into a weapon, every scar seen and unseen. She would give the world a portrait of the real Jedediah Cain, and let the truth be their shield and their sword. It was an act of profound desperation, a gamble that would surely provoke the beast. But it was the only move she had left that felt like an attack rather than a retreat. The writing began the next night. It was a harrowing, painful exorcism at the same table where Cain's violation had been represented by Lillian's music box. Cora now sat with pen and paper, determined to reclaim the space with her own narrative. The first words were the hardest, her hand trembling as the floodgates of memory opened. She could feel the chill of his presence, hear the hollow echo of his voice. But Josiah was a steadfast rock in that storm. He sat nearby, a silent guardian, the slow, rhythmic scrape of his whetstone against steel, a grounding sound in the turbulent quiet. He did not pry or advise. He simply provided a safe harbor from which her battered spirit could venture out to confront its ghosts. "Night after night," she wrote, the story pouring out of her onto the pages. She detailed the suffocating atmosphere of his godly home, the way his love was a form of surveillance, his care a form of control, with painstaking clarity. She described the night of her branding, not with self-pity, but with the cold, precise fury of a witness giving testimony. As she wrote, a transformation occurred. The act of shaping her trauma into a narrative gave her a sense of power over it. The shame began to dissolve, replaced by a righteous indignation. This was not just her story. She was a cartographer, mapping the dark, hidden territory of a monster's soul. When at last she set down the pen, the letter was not a victim's plea. It was a survivor's indictment. Josiah knew this document was too volatile for any local channels. He rode for Oakhaven, a county seat 2 days away, beyond the immediate grasp of the Gilded Mountain Mining Company. There, in a small, chaotic office overflowing with books and yellowing newsprint, he found Elias Vance, the aging, fearless editor of the Oakhaven Chronicle. Vance was a man made of ink, grit, and a stubborn refusal to be intimidated. He read Cora's letter in silence, his expression shifting from professional skepticism to a deep, weary recognition, and finally to the rekindling of an old, journalistic fire. How do I know this isn't just a scorned woman's tale? He asked, his eyes sharp. Josiah met his gaze. Because I treated the wound on her ankle myself, he said quietly. It wasn't made by a scorned woman. It was made by a man playing God. That was all Vance needed to hear. He promised it would be the front page. But be warned, the old man said. When you throw a rock this big, you'd better be prepared for the tidal wave that comes back. The story, when it was published, was more than a wave. It was a quiet earthquake. The newspaper spread through the territories, read aloud in hushed tones in bunkhouses, and whispered about over fences. For many, it was a source of thrilling, vicarious scandal. But for a scattered few, for the women living in their own versions of Cain's prison, Cora's words were a key turning in a lock they thought had rusted shut. Her testimony gave voice to their own silent screams. The first to arrive was a woman named Martha, who appeared at the homestead a week later. She was a wraith, with fear-haunted eyes and a hand that nervously clutched a tattered copy of the newspaper. She stood at the edge of the clearing for a full hour before finding the courage to approach. I read it, she whispered to Cora, her voice trembling. The words, they were my words. She didn't have to explain further. Cora saw the faint, yellowing bruise on her temple and understood completely. She took the woman's hand and led her inside. Soon, another came, a girl barely 16, fleeing a father whose piety was a justification for his fists. Then another, a widow whose husband, a friend of Martha's, had died in a logging accident after questioning Cain's authority. The homestead transformed. The deep silence of grief was replaced by the soft, hesitant sounds of shared histories. Stories of pain, long held in isolation, were now brought into the light of the communal fire. Their power to shame and isolate diminished with each telling. Josiah's house, once a monument to a single, private sorrow, had become a sanctuary for a collective one. He found himself repairing more bunks than fences, his solitude replaced by the quiet, resilient presence of these survivors. Cain's retaliation was inevitable, and it was merciless. It came on a moonless night, a sudden, terrifying orange glow that painted the sky. The barn was engulfed in flames, a roaring inferno that consumed years of labor in minutes. The heat was intense, the smell of kerosene a clear and deliberate message. They scrambled to free the terrified horses, but the structure itself was a complete loss. As the sun rose on the smoldering ruins, they saw his final, contemptuous signature, a twisted cross, painted in black pitch on the side of the tool shed. Cain had intended the fire to be a symbol of his power, an act of terror designed to scatter them like frightened birds. He had misjudged them entirely. As the small group of women stood before the ruin, their faces streaked with soot and tears, their fear was eclipsed by a shared, incandescent rage. They had all been burned out of their lives before. They would not be burned out of this one. That morning, there was no talk of leaving, no sense of defeat. Under Cora's quiet, newfound leadership and Josiah's grim, practical guidance, they began to prepare. They did not clear the debris. They picked up shovels. "He thinks this will make us run," Cora said, her voice clear and steady as she looked at the faces around her. "He doesn't understand. We have nowhere left to run to. So we will make our stand here." They began to dig, their movements unified and determined. They were no longer just building defenses. They were carving a new home out of the very earth. A fortress built not of wood or stone, but of their collective, unyielding will to survive. Cora Shaw learned that the silence before a battle is its own unique terrain of fear. In the wake of the barn's destruction, a grim, purposeful quiet descended upon the homestead, the air thick with the unspoken knowledge that a final confrontation was imminent. They worked together, this unlikely family of survivors, turning the small cabin into a defensible island in a sea of hostile wilderness. They were no longer waiting to be hunted. They were preparing to make their stand. Jedediah Kane, his authority challenged and his pride publicly shredded, would not be content with warnings by fire. He would come to extinguish the source of his humiliation, to erase the truth she had dared to speak aloud. He appeared at high noon, leading a column of a dozen riders who crested the ridge like a dark tide. They were not the furtive shadows of his previous visits. This was an open declaration of war. The men were a grim assortment of loyal logging crew and hired guns, their faces hard and impassive. They did not charge. Instead, they fanned out, encircling the homestead in a suffocating embrace, a tactic designed to intimidate, to let the weight of their numbers crush the spirit of those within. Inside the cabin, the women exchanged glances, their fear a palpable thing, but it was now tempered by a shared, defiant resolve. As the afternoon sun began its long descent, casting impossibly long shadows across the valley, another small party of riders was spotted on the trail below. It was Sheriff Brody, and with him were 4 men whose arrival sent a jolt of renewed hope through the besieged homestead. Cora recognized the stubborn set of Elias Vance's jaw, the old editor armed with a heavy shotgun as if to personally defend the words he had printed. With him were the town blacksmith, whose massive arms were weapons in themselves, and 2 quiet ranchers who valued their independence above all else. They were not an army, but they were an answer. They were proof that Cora's voice had not just been heard, but had been heeded. Kane's ultimatum was delivered by a rider under a flag of truce, his voice laced with arrogance. "Send out the woman. The rest of you will be forgotten by morning." Josiah's reply was delivered from the porch, his voice echoing in the still air. "There are no women here for the taking," he called out. "Only a family. And this family stands together." The rider retreated, and as dusk began to bleed across the sky, the first gunshot shattered the peace. The battle for the house on the hill began. Kane's men advanced under the cover of the growing darkness, but they were met with a disciplined, ferocious defense. Josiah, drawing upon the grim lessons of a war he had tried to forget, directed their fire with calm precision. The women, positioned at the windows and in the shallow trenches they had dug, laid down a steady, suppressing fire. They were not expert marksmen, but their courage made every shot count. The air became a chaotic symphony of splintering wood, ricocheting lead, and shouted commands. In the heart of the fight, Cora was a blur of motion, her spirit a calming anchor in the storm. She moved from one defender to another, reloading rifles, offering a steadying hand. Her own fear burned away by the heat of the moment. The battle raged, a desperate struggle of attrition. Then, seeing his assault falter against the unyielding defense, Kane strode forward into the firelight, his face a mask of fury, bellowing at his men to press the attack. In his rage, he exposed himself, and Cora seized the moment. She stepped onto the porch, the firefight momentarily quieting as all eyes turned to her. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a scream, but a clear, resonant bell of truth that carried across the clearing. "Jedediah Kane," she called. "You tell these men they fight for your honor, for the law. Let me tell you of his law." She addressed his wavering men directly now. "His law is a brand carved into the flesh of a wife who displeased him. His honor is a secret, kept with fists and with fear. He doesn't fight for any god, you know. He fights because his greatest fear is a woman who is no longer afraid of him." The words struck home, more devastating than any bullet. The hired guns looked at each other, then at the ferocious servants' determined faces defending the cabin, and finally at the enraged man who had led them here. They had been paid to subdue a runaway, not to die for a tyrant's private shame. As his authority crumbled, Cain's rage consumed him. With a guttural roar, he raised his own pistol, his sole intent to silence the voice that had undone him. He lunged forward, but was met by the unwavering barrels of Josiah's rifle and the sheriff's shotgun. "It's over, Cain," Brody said, his voice heavy with finality. "Surrounded, his power broken, his hypocrisy laid bare for all to see. Jedediah Kane was captured, not as a formidable villain, but as a pathetic man consumed by his own hate." In the quiet that followed, the defenders emerged, a small, weary band bound together by the shared ordeal. The threat was gone. The long night was over. In the weeks that followed, the story became legend, and the law, now bolstered by public opinion and the courageous testimony of over half a dozen women, dealt with Cain decisively. The Gilded Mountain Mining Company, in an act of self-preservation, cut all ties, leaving him to face justice alone. The homestead on the hill began to breathe again. The trenches were filled, not with dirt, but with the seeds of a new garden. One bright autumn afternoon, the community gathered. It was a collection of souls unimaginable just months before Josiah. Cora, the women and children who had found refuge, and the handful of townsfolk who had stood with them. Together, they began to raise the frame of a new barn from the ashes of the old. The rhythmic sound of hammers became the valley's new heartbeat, punctuated by the bright, clear sound of children's laughter. As the sun set, painting the sky in hues of rose and gold, Josiah and Cora stood side by side, watching the structure take shape against the twilight. He looked at the life teeming in his once silent clearing, the women working, the children playing, and realized he was not just building a barn. He was honoring Lillian's memory in the most profound way possible by cultivating life, not by mourning death. Cora glanced down at her ankle. The scar was still there, a pale line against her skin. But it was no longer a brand of ownership. It was a map of the journey that had led her, against all odds, to a home. The house on the hill was no longer a fortress of solitude. It was a testament, its windows glowing with a warm, steady light, a beacon of hope in the vast, wild heart of the West.